Hello, everyone. Welcome to Audubon Society of Central Arkansas's monthly meeting. I'm Vice President Dan Scheinman, and it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker this month. That is Matthew Young, who is president and founder of the Finch Research Network. He has a BS in water resources with a minor in meteorology from SUNY-Oneonta and an MS in ornithology from the SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry at Syracuse University. He was a regional editor of the Kingbird for 10 years. Kingbird is the state ornithological journal of New York. He was an adjunct professor in environmental studies at SUNY-Cortland, and currently teaches an intro to birding class for Cornell University and is the board chair at the Wetland Trust. In addition to all that stuff, for over 25 years, he's been a social worker. He's also worked at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology for 15 years, where he's done extensive field work, including leading the lab's first Finch Irruptive Bird Survey for BirdSource way back in 1999. He was the collections management leader and audio engineer at the Macaulay Library for 12 years, where he edited and engineered sounds for Merlin, and also songs of the Warblers of North America, Audubon Society, Voices of Hawaii's Birds, and more. He's been a guide for Victor Emanuel Nature Tours, written Finch species accounts for birds of the world, and published papers about the Red Crossbill vocal complex. If you have ever tried to record the voice of a Red Crossbill and wanted to know which type it was, you probably sent your recording to Matt. And currently he's working on Finches of North America with Lillian Stokes. So he has quite the pedigree, and I'm quite excited to hear what he has to say about winter finches and hopefully what that means for Arkansas's winter finch forecast, such as it is. Take it away, Matt.
All right, thanks for all that, Dan, and thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure to talk to groups. I think this is the furthest south I've presented to a group. I'm now covered from most of the Northeast, most of the Great Lakes to British Columbia, and now down to Arkansas. So it's wonderful to be here tonight. Just to give you a little bit of a little more of my background, I guess. That's, me feeding some red pulls a few years ago. But really, I finished my undergraduate degree in meteorology, hydrogeology in 1995, and I realized I did not want to go into that field. The most, common job at the time in 1995 was something called LUST. It was the assessment of leaky underground storage tanks in the country. And so when I finished, that spring, I literally bought a pair of binoculars. I had just started birding. Took an Audubon, actually, continuing ed class, and that's what started my birding interest a little bit. And then I bought a car and went to a Grateful Dead concert, got up next morning, and started driving to this location. Anybody know? Make it a little interactive. Anybody know what that location is there? Any guesses? That is Lower Falls, Yellowstone. That's Yellowstone River, Lower Falls. And it was there where my whole life literally pivoted on a dime. Now, I didn't know it at the time. When I arrived in June of 95, I grabbed my binoculars, went to Lower Falls, and a flock of birds flew in above me. And I remember looking up at them. Like I said, I just started birding, and I could see these seed coats dropping to the ground, and they were crossbills extracting seeds. And literally my whole world started to shift at that moment. I didn't know it. And then I started to become a birder. Now I want to just share with everybody like the feeding mechanism of crossbills and why they were so captivating to me and how it ended up shifting my world. So I'm just going to share this video with everybody.
Of the 10,000 bird species on Earth, only 5, all in the finch family, have crossed bills. The white-winged crossbill is found in the higher latitudes of North America, traveling from coast to coast in large flocks in search of white spruce trees. Females are greenish yellow, males red, and both have two distinct white bars on the wings. Their unique crossed bill, with the lower mandible curving under the upper maxilla, is adapted to reach heavily protected seeds found under tough cone scales. To reach the seeds, a white-wing places the tip of the curved lower mandible against the cone while inserting the upper maxilla under the scale. Beak partially open, the bird uses the curved mandible as a lever, twisting his head as he pries up the scale. He eats the seed, discarding the husk.
You're going to see some seed coats falling in the background of some of the footage here.
The curve of the mandible provides the leverage needed to force the scale up, enabling crossbills to feed on seeds that are not accessible to other species. A white-wing often twists the cone off and carries it to a perch where it holds the cone in one claw and rotates it like a corn cob.
The seed coat's falling there.
Lower mandibles cross either left or right, and each individual always holds the cone in the claw toward which their mandible curves. This ensures that the tip of the mandible is facing the cone, giving the bird the best leverage to quickly pluck the seeds. White-wings are remarkably efficient at harvesting their food. An individual bird can eat up to 3,000 seeds per day. Crossbills are able to swiftly bypass a conifer's armor as a direct result of their specialized beaks, an excellent example of evolutionary adaptation.
Never get sick of looking at that footage. That was a flock of white-winged crossbills I had found here, not too far from where I live, near Ithaca, New York, back in 2008. Brought the crew out there, and they videoed it, and I helped put the narration together. That's not a species that you get really in Arkansas, although I wonder. I imagine there's probably a state record or two for them, right? Anybody know, Dan?
For white-winged crossbill?
Yeah, any records at all?
Yes, there are.
I figured that. Yeah,
Not for a
cool.
long time.
Yeah. Not a common species. Now, red crossbill, obviously a bit more common, and I'll get into that as we kind of go through this presentation. From Yellowstone, I actually then went to this location. This is kind of the forgotten mountain in the Cascades. This is Mount Adams, actually. I was in an AmeriCorps position, and that's where my career continued to kind of move towards birds, going from the Yellowstone to this location. So here we are now. That was 95. We're now, 28 years later, and I've launched the Finch Research Network with a board of directors, and we have 4 different professors at 4 different universities, 2 different people in Canada, a person in Germany. It's quite the diverse group. And it's been nothing but an incredible last few years here. I could not have we could not have launched the Finch Research Network in a better year. 2020, 2021 was a super flight of finches, and I'll get into that a little bit. That's basically when almost all of the eastern eruptive finches moved southward in mass, out of the boreal forest. So we want everybody to be part of this. It's a big tent. We want from scientists to audio recordists to citizen scientists to artists that are interested in finches. And we, dedicated the site when we launched it to Ian Newton, who wrote the Finches book in Europe in 1973, and Ron Pittaway, who was the creator of the winter finch forecast that a lot of people have read or have heard over the years. Unfortunately, Ron just passed away a couple months ago. So yeah, everybody, we'd love to see everybody get involved. Anybody who has any interest in this, and we have a few iNaturalist projects that we launched in just the last few months that I'll get into. So, where is the Finch Research Network going with Finch forecasts and all things Finch? Research, education, conservation, and even wellness. We're we're big believers in that we don't do what we do just for the data. We do it also because we love what we do, and observing birds is actually good for us. There's just paper after paper after paper now coming out with the mental health benefits of engaging with nature and getting outside to study birds. So the Winter Finch forecast 2023. This is probably why most people, are one of the main reasons why people might be here tonight. Tyler Orr, who is now the Finch forecaster, took over for Ron Pittaway in 2020. He's also a board member of the Finch Research Network. He is now the new Finch forecaster that I work with. So he originated in 1999. Format evolved over a few years. It was 2003 that it kind of got its format that it's now had for over 20 years. Ron's enthusiasm was been just amazing over the years. And I started to help him and do the Crossbill piece of the forecast around 2010. Crossbills are kind of where most people, as Dan said, if anybody's recorded a red crossbill, you probably sent it to me or maybe Tim Spar. He's another one that does a lot of identification of red crossbill recordings. So boreal forest is where a lot of these boreal finches, these eruptive finches, birds, finches that are irregularly move out of the boreal forest. Some years they push all the way down to Arkansas. Some years you probably see almost none. You're kind of on the edge. Purple finch, pine siskin, probably the most common ones that you get there. And I'll cover some of these as well. Here we have almost 100 different people across the boreal from coast to coast. Just understand that the forecast originated with Ron Pittaway in Ontario. So there's a cluster of people that give reports every July. Tyler sends an email out and says, hey, these 15 species of conifers and deciduous trees and fruiting trees, can you please assess the food crop on them and then send your report in? And that's how this thing is formulated. And that's how this thing has been going on now for, this was the 25th year that it's been in existence. So those dots, people report what they're finding on the food crop from year to year. So, we have them rate cone, berry, deciduous tree seed crops from none to very poor to average, good, excellent, bumper. That's a red spruce tree with what I would call a good to excellent cone crop. And then what is affecting this year's cone crop? So there's always kind of these cyclical temperature precipitation patterns that drive regional cone crops or seed crops from year to year. There's also insect infestations like spruce budworm outbreaks, which birds boom bust with a lot of times. A lot of people probably heard of the spruce budworm warblers, Cape May warbler, bay-breasted warbler, Tennessee warbler. Cape Mays have been up the last few years. And then we get this question a lot lately, how are the fires impacting the food crop across the boreal, and how much of a player is it in driving some of these irregular eruptive movements? 2021 was a super flight. 8 of the 9 finches in the east all moved in pretty big numbers out of the boreal. Again, Arkansas doesn't see them. Some of these species like pine grosbeak. I wonder if Arkansas probably doesn't have a pine grosbeak record, right? Do you know, Dan?
I need to check that.
I think that's one you.
No, we don't.
Never had, yeah. But I'm sure there's a couple redpoll records though.
Oh yeah, for sure. We've had common redpoll, and then during the major eruption, we had evening grosbeaks in the state for the first time in like 30 years.
Yeah, and I was gonna get to that for sure. So yeah, in that eruption, it was the first time I looked at the eBird map, and we'll get to that just a couple days ago, and I put that in one of the slides here. So yeah, spruce budworm natural cycles of these food crops tend to have a little bit of a up and down cycle to them naturally. One year it'll be good, and if the trees are putting in energy to produce a good crop, the following year it tends to be poorer. And then there's, what they call bumper or excellent cone crops that form periodically, and that varies from tree species to tree species. There was a generational cone crop in the 2019-2020 year of spruce, and that produced high reproductive success in some of these finches, as did this ongoing spruce budworm outbreak that has been occurring in wide areas across Ontario and Quebec the last 9 years now. So that's a big reason why, the Evening Grosbeak invasions of the last 2 of the last 4 years actually made it to Arkansas. I believe there was even a few records last winter in Arkansas of Evening Grosbeak, right?
Yeah, and let me correct myself. We do have pine grosbeak records, 4 of them, the last one from 1989.
Wow. I didn't realize they made it that far south. Interesting. I should know that, but now I do. So thank you. So pine siskins, purple finches into Arkansas this year. I think pine siskin is going to be the biggest player in the eastern part of the continent this year. I expect big numbers of them to push, and especially in the middle part of the country this year. We'll see East Coast wise, but I think you're going to have an above average pine siskin year. There hasn't really been a lot of pine siskins, I'd say, the last 2 years since the super flight in 3 years ago. That was when Audubon actually ran an article that year, and I was quoted in it, and it said basically siskins had taken over the country. It was just a massive invasion a couple of years ago, or 3 years ago. Purple finches seem to be a little bit more like regular every other year. Like you said, you get a few some years, and then every other year you get bigger numbers. And I think that also is going to be going on. You're not going to probably have as many as the super flight year, but I expect more than, the year after the super flight this year. Red Crossbills. Now we put out we do these eruption alerts on the blog. If you subscribe to the Finch Research Network website, we put out these eruption alerts, and we put out a Red Crossbill eruption alert back in August, I think it was. There's been a really big movement of type 2s and 4s across the northern half of the country. And they haven't, I think there was at least one record of Red Crossbill in Arkansas. I think it was maybe early September or August. I do think you're going to get in on more Red Crossbills. Probably will be in that upper northwestern corner of the state where you typically get the larger numbers. In fact, I was a co-author on a paper on crossbills with Kimberly Smith and Joe O'Neill, is it? Is that right?
Joe Neal,
yeah. And also then I did another paper with Anant Deshwal and Pooja Panwar, I think it was.
Yeah.
Looking at also some of these crossbill events in Arkansas. So you do get in on some crossbills. It's not by any means, they're not a common bird, but I do think pine siskins are something that a lot of you will see in your backyard this year. So education and research. So we launched an iNaturalist project, Become a Winter Finch Forecaster. And again, this is a kind of more for the northern part of the country and into Canada, because that kind of is what determines whether we get them, in the States and further south. So this is the project. I'll run through this just a little bit. Finch forecast food assessment. You could kind of, put in the species there. Like if you saw eastern white pine, you could rate the cone crop. Down here, this is a screenshot. It's not a live thing, but Finch forecast food assessment. that's none there, but you have all the other ones in the drop down that you can rate it as. There's 30 people already in this. We just launched this just a couple months ago, 6 weeks ago, I think. We have quite a few sightings. There's a map there. And then the cast of characters for the winter finch forecast, we've already kind of covered them, but I'll run through them. The red poles, you know, there was a paper 2 years ago. There still has not been a proposal to lump these two species. There has been a lot of talk of these two, common red pole on the left, hoary red pole on the right, these two species being lumped together as one. We'll see what happens with that. That study actually that started us down this road of them possibly being lumped actually started at my house in Cortland, New York. I had this great flock that showed up back in 2013, I think it was, winter of 2013. Evening Grosbeak, pine grosbeak, just gorgeous birds. Never get enough of them. So Evening Grosbeak, you can see here in 2020, 2021, I think there were 8 or 9 locations that had Evening Grosbeak in Arkansas that year. Then the following year, again, this gets to that biennial pattern or that every other year pattern. There were none in the state. And the same could be said in, oh, I thought I had another map there. Let me see here. Yeah, I thought I had another map there. I don't know if I lost a little bit when my computer crashed, but that's all right. I got most of the information here. So there's the Crossbills. This was a photo last year of them in the Adirondacks. Red Crossbill 2021. You know, there was pretty decent numbers in Arkansas. You can see in the northwestern part of the state. And then, you know, you get them, people don't realize that they're actually year round down the spine of the Appalachians as well. Different call types though. So you can see them again, they kind of come down, but I don't think there was just, again, there's usually a record or two in that northwestern part of the state. I do think there will be some coming into Arkansas at some point. So I actually did the call type maps as well. And you can see here, so when I say call type, what the heck's a call type? So when crossbills fly over, they give these jip calls. And with those calls is an implied ecological specialization based on these, you know, slight differences in beak size that helps them forage efficiently on certain conifer species. So, you know, with, like I said, with the flight call comes this implied ecological specialization. If you record them, people have sent me recordings over the years, and you can actually identify them by doing an audio spectrographic analysis. So it gives a signature of the bird's voice. So type 2, which is primarily a Western call type, has marched across the country since starting in July. And that is the one that you typically will find in the biggest numbers in Arkansas in the eruption years. So I do think you'll get in on some of these. And you can see, Dan, you know, there's plenty of them in Wisconsin this year. There's a pretty good numbers of type 2s. The more exciting one though is type 4. It is relatively rare east of the Western Great Lakes. Even in the Western Great Lakes, I'd say it's quite uncommon and local. I've been looking at this and been finch focused for much of my life, for 25 years. I've never seen type 4s. There's never been a documented invasion moving into the Northeast as early as they did this year. The only time, at least back to the mid 90s and maybe back to 1970, was the last big invasion in the Northeast. There were pretty decent numbers in the Western Great Lakes in 2017, though. And this is the other one that when they move out of the Rockies or move to the east, type 4s often will move with type 2s. So I would not be surprised as winter progresses that some type 4s show up in Arkansas as well. But again, it'll be in that northwestern part of the state probably. Type 3 is another one. That's the one that's most common eruptive across the northern tier states. And there's some evidence that they are also moving west to east. All right. So I had an Evening Grosbeak map that I hadn't switched and must not have saved it. But you can see, just bouncing back here, 2024. Last year there were none. And then last winter there were a few records in Arkansas. Purple finches, it's the one that you get in on the most. Look at the superflight ear, deeper purples, just huge numbers of them down in your area. I imagine there were flocks of people who had flocks of maybe 10, 20 even at a time. Then the following year, much lighter colors in Arkansas. And then last year, a pretty good invasion down there. I think you're going to see another pretty good invasion make it to Arkansas this year. But, this is early. This is starting just in the last 2 months. I have listed September to March there. But obviously, we're not into March 2024 yet. So I think you'll get in on purple finches this year as well. And then pine siskins, there's the superflight year, 2020, 2021, just massive numbers across the southern part of the United States. And then very little the following year, very light purples. And then again, very little, very few last year as well. They're moving in mass. There's been, days in the northern, like at Hawk Ridge in Minnesota and Tadoussac in Quebec. There's been consistent days for the last 2 weeks of anywhere from 1,000 to upwards of 10,000 pine siskins moving at some of these migration points. So I think it's just a matter of time before you start to see them. I imagine you probably don't really start seeing them until November down there, though, would be my guess. So a couple other projects. We have an Evening Grosbeak foraging project and a Red Crossbill foraging project as well. We're very interested in diet of these two species. Crossbill, obviously, because of the ecological specialization. We believe there's more ecological specialization going on in the Evening Grosbeak group too, which also has the call type phenomenon. A lot of people don't realize that. It's also a bird, which I'll talk about this a little bit later. It's also a species that has been designated as a road to recovery bird. 90% decline in Evening Grosbeaks since the 1970s. We're just now starting to see kind of the bird coming out of that dip a little bit just in the last few years. And that's why you've seen some in Arkansas. Just wanted to show this. Again, Tom Johnson, a big friend of a lot of us in the birding scene, also passed away tragically at a young age, but he just was an amazing birder, so enthusiastic. Took this video a few years ago of Red Crossbill foraging. And again, just incredible footage. They're like parrots, these the finches, in my opinion, particularly crossbills. Look at that. I apologize. My voice is a little raspy, and hopefully it holds up. This is my 6th meeting of the day, so It's kind of a long day, but just to give people a little bit of insight on, the spectrograph and how to read these recordings that I'm talking about when people send me recordings. So I'm just going to play this. It's a crested oripendula, full speed. Can everybody hear that all right? Okay. Now I'm going to play at half speed. Our brains have a hard time processing speed or sound at full speed. So I'm going to slow it down and you can kind of catch up a little bit better. Our brains can kind of process it a bit better. Kind of cool. It's a great sound. Almost sounds like taking your finger over like a comb or something. And I use this species just to kind of show the ability to kind of like see the spectrogram, hear the spectrogram, process the sound as it's happening. It's wicked cool. Whereas in the crossbills, it's a little bit harder. It's a great species for showing that. Again, the crossbill dynamic is that complex is really where I've kind of in a lot of ways made I guess a name for myself over time. There's 12 call types. We just described a new one in the last year, type 12. I won't get into that much at all tonight, but I will at least touch on the map of it because I do think you probably will end up getting a record of it in Arkansas. There are no records of it as of now that I know of. So this is what I mean by the spectrograms of they're like sonograms of the bird's voice of the 12 different call types of red crossbills. And this is actually a chart that will go in the book that Lillian Stokes and I have coming out. It's actually now coming out next September. So it's been pushed out 5 months, partly because of bottlenecks in the production chain, to believe it or not, of paper and printing and all of that. So before I go kind of jump into it though, why even bother studying call types of something, and in a lot of ways, I don't really care if they end up being elevated to species status. These call types do recognize one another, and like call type wants to mate with like call type because of that ecological specialization. But about 6-7 years ago, type 9 was elevated to a full species, Cassia crossbill. And basically, this bird is only found in 2 mountain ranges in Idaho. There was a scientist, Dr. Craig Bankman, published a lot on crossbills. He asked himself the question in the late 90s, is there a mountain range east of the Rockies where lodgepole pine could be found, but there were no tree squirrels? Tree squirrels drive cone evolution where tree squirrels are present. If you take tree squirrels out of the equation, though, Dr. Bankman found by studying the morphology of the cones that with tree squirrels, it put more energy in the thickening of the distal stalk of the cone, because that's where the squirrels will bite the stalk off. If you ever walk through a conifer forest, anybody in their life, and you hear like clanging from the trees, a lot of times that's literally conifer cones dropping to the ground. They're harvesting the cones, the squirrels. You take the squirrels out of the equation, and he was able to measure that this particular local variant of lodgepole pine was putting more energy into the thickening of the scales of the cone, making it harder for the crossbills to actually get the seed out of the scale. And he studied them, did a mark recapture study over 15 years, found that they were a different, had a different spectrogram, different look, different sound. They were largely not known at the time to move around out of these mountains. these particular isolated mountains are almost like sky islands in a sense. But I'll get to that a little bit more. I'll cycle back on that a little more in a second here. So he proposed them to be a new species 2009 at first. The vote was 5-5. And then he collected some more data based on input from the committee, proposed them to be a new species around 2015, I think it was 2016. It was accepted as a full species, 8-2 vote. There's committees that make votes on this stuff. Us humans love to study this kind of stuff. The interesting thing is 50% of the range of this particular non-nomadic crossbill don't really move around. They were thought to, they assortatively mate 99% of the time with their own call type. So very little hybridization was going on. But since half the range, these two mountain ranges burned 3 summers ago, there are now Cassia crossbills or type 9 red crossbills showing up in Colorado in decent numbers, and they're actually breeding in Colorado. And the interesting thing about that is there was another scientist, I'm spacing his name now because it's late in the day, that proposed them to be lumped back together. The vote went 6-4 in favor of keeping them as a species, but that was right before this last information has now unfolded over the last few years of them being found in Colorado and them actually breeding in Colorado. So I kind of expect probably this bird will be lumped back in with the red crossbill complex as type 9. But that's an unfolding story. So just to run you through quickly, give you some sounds, what the spectrogram looks like. Type 1 and type 2 are known to have bred in Arkansas. I think type 1's a little bit more common, but both of those have bred in Arkansas. Here's what type 1 sounds like. So there's a slight uptick, then a down sweeping, dry sounding choo choo choo. Type 2 is pretty similar, to tell you the truth, but a little lower pitched. It's a fairly large billed bird compared to type 1. So there was a scientist, I'll shut up here for a second. So there was a scientist, Dr. Jeff Groff, that studied this phenomenon, studied type 1s and 2s in the Appalachians in the 1980s and then early 90s. And he started traveling around the country, was recording them, capturing them, realized that there was this flight call phenomenon, was actually proposed them as an evolving complex of cryptic species. Type 9 was the first one to be split out as a full species. But, different environmental conditions kind of push these birds together every so often, which keeps some gene flow going. So I don't really think, even though they act as good biological species most of their lives, I don't think we are going to be looking at a situation where many of these, if any of them, will ever be raised to species status. Type 3 is the most eruptive across the northern tier states. There are records in Arkansas. But you can see it's a zigzag shape. Similar sounding, different looking spectrogram. I realize, though, I have listened to far too many crossbills for any healthy human being probably at this point. Type 4, though, is very different sounding, and this is one you do get in Arkansas as well. Very bouncy sounding to me. Plick, 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 down, up. And then, like I said, we described type 12, which kind of ended up being an evolution of, there was type 4, and within type 4, we ended up realizing there was a couple other different call types, and we just described type 12. I don't think there's going to be an ongoing, number of continual, numbers of crossbills that we're going to keep discovering. However, what happens with these birds a lot of times, and how we've ended up with 12 different call types is they erupt to different areas. And if they find conditions, enough food in an area, that's how you get a lineage of a call type that will actually stabilize over time. And that's what we found with type 12. There are records, Kentucky, Alabama. I think it's just a matter of time that Arkansas gets in on it. So Evening Grosbeak, the Evening Grosbeak Road to Recovery project is probably the second big project that the Finch Research Network is involved in, probably really the most important one. I mean, we're very interested in this Crossbill project, but 90% decline. It's a collaborative project that's been funded by the Knobloch Foundation and Smithsonian. We've been working with Pete Mara. It's also collaborative with the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy and Carnegie Museum and Powder Mill Avian Research Center. And we've been, going to various parts of Maine, Minnesota, Pennsylvania, the Adirondacks, and there's the project partners. We've been putting these tags on these birds, and it's an experimental project. We're trying to capture a very small percentage of birds to put these satellite tags and also nano tags on these birds to get readings on how they're moving around throughout their life cycle. So you can kind of see on this bird, there's this tag coming down the back here. And that's what we've been working on the last few years. And the Finch Research Network's been doing a lot of the outreach part of this project at times, or the co-production part of it they talk about. I don't expect people to read this. Just Evening Grosbeaks are a fascinating bird in that they weren't really found in the eastern part of the United States until the late 1800s. And the idea is they believe they kind of followed plantings of box elders across the Canadian plains. And then when they got here, there were burgeoning budworm outbreaks, and that's what they started to feed on. And they decided to stay in parts of the east, and they're even a breeding bird in parts of the northeast. And that only really started, confirmations of Evening Grosbeaks breeding in the northeastern states only really actually ended up being confirmed until like the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. So there's the decline up to about 2020. As you can see, just big declines. So we're trying to figure out, assess knowledge of threats and limiting factors. Budworm, it's clearly a budworm bird that opportunistically will feed in these budworm. It's basically these caterpillars that are very rich in protein, very abundant, that they feed to the young, which increases reproductive success. But they're also the highest. If you look at we have different focal kind of topics within the Grosbeak project, and they're actually in the USGS database. They are the most common bird for window collisions. They are the highest. Purple finch is third, and Evening Grosbeak is first. how much is climate change and change of habitat also playing into it? I mean, it's not rocket science in some ways when you step back. Finches, which, a lot of us enjoy finches because they often make up a lot of the individuals we'll see at feeders. I mean, they're social and they flock. So it's not uncommon to see a flock of, 30 goldfinches or 30 house finches at a time. So, it increases chances of window collisions. Call type phenomenon also exists. I actually have six different spectrograms there because I think there might be a sixth call type. There's 2 type 3s listed there. It's the only one we get in the East is type 3. They don't seem to mix and erupt in each other's ranges as much. Type 3 is eruptive in the East. Type 1 is the only one that's really eruptive in the West. And I'll play these. They're quite different to my ears. And then type 1 is like a pure tone whistle. I mean, when I go out west and I hear it for the first time for, in several years, I'm always like, what the heck is that bird? And I'm like, oh yeah, it's Evening Grosbeak. It's like this pure tone whistle to me. Doesn't really have that raspy, burry quality to it, that ringing quality. Type 1 does range throughout the West, so it erupts where other call types exist. And we hope to get out west. So we've been using these, and again, I'm spacing the name right now, these traps. So we will go to feeder areas, put out seed. We, of course, do not do bow net traps, they're called. We would not, you end up sitting in a tent, often about 10 degrees out or colder, and you watch them come down, and then you try to, capture 4 or 5 at a time to put these tags on them. So it's, we're just trying to get some information, across the life cycle, where they're moving around, so we can hopefully study. And we want, we're trying to build a stakeholder group from locals to conservationists to, agency and government entities and so on and so forth. So it's a pretty exciting project. It's a dream come true in some ways. There's a lot of care that goes into this, a lot of preparation that goes into this. We called this bird Champ. I'll get to that in a second because it's, here's the overall numbers. This project actually started with the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy, starting looking at wintering populations in Pennsylvania in 2017. And then the project grew. And when we launched the Finch Research Network, they reached out and said, hey, do you want to be part of this in 2020? And then it's just in the last 2 years became this Road to Recovery bird. And so, we're constantly attending meetings and getting different organizations involved. And yeah, we have radio tagged 85 individuals over the last 2 years since the Finch Research Network has been part of it, total of 160. And then satellite tags 46. So the difference between those, they look very similar when you look at them on the bird, but radio tags are these Modus tower tags. So I don't know if people have heard of Modus towers. Basically, it's almost like a telemetry thing. If the bird flies over the tower, you get a reading. Satellite tags, though, are driven by, sunlight. So you could get readings on birds every day. So you get a lot more information on the satellite tags compared to the radio tags. But they're also a lot more expensive, the satellite tags. So here's Champ. This bird was tagged. We put a satellite tag on it in April of 2022, right? Yeah, 22. And we have now have data on this bird across 2 different, annual cycles. It's pretty fascinating to see it. It often will winter in Maine or this Quebec area and then comes back up to New Brunswick to breed every year. And so we've had 14, more than 12 months transmitting. Is actually now 18 months, I think, we've gotten transmissions on this bird. So it might be as many as 2,000 total positions at this point. Here's also some movements of other birds that have been tagged. You can see we also tagged birds at Saxon Bog in Minnesota as well. And then, this is what I'm talking about with that migratory connectivity, trying to get connectivity and life cycle information on birds moving back and forth between winter and breeding grounds, and what routes are they using doing that. And then here's some data that we just got this past spring. And you can see bird was tagged in Minnesota, ended up coming back to almost Quebec here. And then we have birds in Pennsylvania that went up to Ontario, and some have gone back to New Brunswick. So it's pretty fascinating to see this project unfold. Now, shifting gears a little bit, another project that the Finch Research Network has been very kind of, at least interested in supporting. We're playing more of a supportive role. We're actually rolling out presentations specifically just on honey creepers. So a lot of people don't realize it. One of the most fascinating adaptive radiations on Earth of birds were the honey creepers in Hawaii, which are actually finches, fringillid finches, unlike Galapagos finches, which are now known as tanagers. A flock of rose finches from Eurasia landed on Hawaii 4 million years ago, and they adaptively radiated to 50 plus species, but it's a conservation crisis now. There's only 15 species left. We just lost another one in the last month or two. And it's a unfolding project that needs as much attention. And, American Bird Conservancy, Finch Research Network, Maui and Kauai recovery teams, University of Hawaii, everybody's trying to work on this. The main reason why it declined over time has been, unfortunately, has been non-native species like feral pigs and snakes. But there's a mosquito there that carries an avian malaria that is basically wiping out a lot of these last species. There is a hope, and there's been a lot of money fundraised, and there is a project that's going to be pilot study is going to happen this next year, where they're trying to make the mosquito infertile. It's a non-native mosquito. It's been kind of a pretty politically charged project too over time. And it's kind of, we're trying one last thing to see if you can make the mosquitoes infertile, the mosquitoes will die off, and hopefully giving a chance to some of these honey creeper species. There are only 1 or 2 species that seem to have formed some resistance to the mosquitoes. So we're rolling out a presentation because there's a lot of people that don't know about this here in the mainland. And we're just trying to raise awareness to raise some money. We just donated $1,000 to the Maui recovery team to try to help them out with some of their work they're doing to save them. And I just kind of gave the story on what it took place 4 to 6 million years ago. Nathan Goldberg is working with the Finch Research Network. We're going to be doing a presentation, rolling it out to certain groups. If you have an opening, let me know. We'll give another talk. I think Nathan's going to be taking the lead on this, but we're excited. Palila, we do cover the Finches of Hawaii in the book that Lillian and I are working on right now. Palila is not doing well at all. A Koe not doing well at all, less than 2,000. And we just lost the Akeka in the wild. There are some birds that were brought into captivity to see if they can, raise them in captivity. And maybe once this mosquito project is kind of taken, hopefully we can mitigate what they're doing as far as biting these birds, and basically the birds are getting this malaria and dying. Hopefully we'll be able to re-release them back into the wild. So yeah, the honey finch or honey creeper project. The last thing that we're very interested in, I did touch upon this very early on in this presentation. We're very interested in the wellness of getting outdoors. All of us at the Finch Research Network, a lot of scientists, a lot of groups interested in the research aspect of things. We don't really talk about our stories enough and why we love to look at birds. It's not just the data, but it's also, it helps us, makes us all feel better when we're a lot of times, watching birds. There's just study after study after study coming out about this now. Here's another, this is a food company, wild bird seed company in Europe, talks about this Exeter University study where they, maintain good health, people. It's why a lot of us like to feed birds in our backyard. So yeah, it starts out right in the backyard. This is a photo I actually took in Chicago a couple of years ago. Red poll on the right, goldfinch on the left. And finches, they make up a big component of the birds we watch in our backyard. This was a feeder watch top 25 list for the 2021-22 season. As you can see, there's 4 or 5 finches on this list. House finch, goldfinch, red poll, purple finch. And here's a video. Actually, this is in Wisconsin, Dan. This was Ryan Brady. You might know Ryan. This is his backyard 2 winters ago. This was an estimate of 750 red polls. Yeah, pretty wild. This was like April, 2 winters ago. 2 springs ago, I should say. Pretty wild. There were a few siskins and a few goldfinches mixed in this flock too. Just, yeah, amazing numbers of red polls. So you'll at some point probably experience this. Totally. And we also launched a feeder cam as part of an outreach in the part of the Evening Grosbeak project. So in Maine, the very northern edge of Maine, near Caribou, we have a finch feeder cam. And this was a scene last winter where we had goldfinches, red polls, siskins, and evening grosbeaks. Some finch apparel, finch forecast shirt. We just launched the forecast a couple weeks ago. We also have a Grosbeaks in Motion on the Road Recovery shirt and a Honey Creeper shirt. And then Lillian and I are finalizing. We're basically in the second round of copy edits on Stokes' Guide to Finches, United States and Canada. We wanted to be correct because we don't actually include birds in Mexico, unlike a lot of the field guides out there that call them, they're called North America. Finch Research Network, we can be found Finch Masters on Instagram and on Facebook, and also Finch's Irruptions and Mass Crops, which is a discussion board for Finch, the Finch Research Network. But that's all I got. My voice barely held up. I'll take any questions, though.
Thank you, Matt. And as a reminder, if you can put your question in the chat, and I can relay that to Matt, or you can take yourself off of mute and ask, and I'll get us started. You mentioned briefly that people are wondering what effect the boreal forest fires are having on the finches. So what is the effect of boreal forest? Or is it too early?
I forgot that. I forgot that little piece. So so the interesting thing about the forest fires, there are, obviously more forest fires than Canada has seen in a long, long time. The highest concentration and the largest ones are in the Western Boreal, Alberta, British Columbia. We don't actually believe it has had that much of an effect. It's obviously is having a little bit because that habitat is taken on a play. But last year, there was a generational food crop in those areas. And this year, there was no food crop. So it's hard to say the fires would have that much of an effect in an area that doesn't have any food anyway this year. So that's been a big question. I'm glad, I kind of rushed through that a little bit, but I'm glad you brought that back up. So we don't actually think for this year it's going to have that much impact at all, actually. And in fact, because that area that is burning is also has a lot of jack pine, which is a species that is serotinous across its range, meaning that the cones have a resin and they're only open up by extreme heat from like a fire. We actually believe crossbills will probably move into those fire regions. And other finches could also opportunistically move into the lodgepole or the jack pine and even some of the lodgepole pine forest and actually feed on them. It's almost like blackback woodpeckers moving in or three toads moving into a beetle outbreak as well. So we don't think a big impact. We might actually see an increase in those areas in the years moving forward, at least for a brief time. So any other questions?
So are eruptions caused by a lack of food forcing finches to move to find food, or is it caused by a banner crop of food that means a whole bunch of new finches, big populations that then surge into new areas, or is it both?
It's both. Yeah. Again, thanks for coming back to that. Yeah.
And
it's both.
Similar to snowy owl eruptions too, right?
Yeah, it's the same kind of dynamic. It's a push-pull in that, you have these, unpredictable, but opportunistically feeding upon these outbreaks of insects or abundant cone crops, leading to, high reproductive success, which boosts the population. And then often what happens is, at least with the cyclical, biennial nature of food crops, the following year, the food crop can't support that high number of, finches that just bred. So they move, a portion of the population is forced to move southward. So it's both. In fact, I just published a paper with Ben Zuckerberg. You know Ben Zuckerberg at all, Dan? Yeah, University of Wisconsin, where, believe it or not, over the last 50, 60 years, the southern edge of eruption zones of the finches have been retreating northward. Like pine grosbeak has become it's a review bird in Pennsylvania. I mean, they haven't had pine grosbeaks in a long time. Now, in the 70s, and you said the last record was 1989 in Arkansas, I think you said, for pine grosbeak.
Yeah.
The 70s, there were successive finch, basically super flights that occurred. And that was because we believe two things happened. You had great generational food crops, an ongoing 25-year budworm outbreak, which eventually, because it was so long, some of the budworm specialists, the populations climbed. But because it was so long as well, budworm over successive years will kill the tree. So you took all that, acreage out of play for the other finches, which led to all of these finches moving in big numbers. There were 5 super flights in 11 years from 1970 to 1981. And again, a lot of the records, if you go in eBird for pine grosbeak, there were a lot of records in the southern part of where nobody sees them anymore, in the 60s and 70s and 80s. So
Lots of factors at play. It's complex.
yeah, it's very complex.
Other questions?
Any other?
I guess just one more for me. I think you've kind of hinted at this. You talked about using the spectrograms, but I assume you can identify red crossbill and even grosbeak call types by ear in the field sometimes.
Yes, I can. I'm probably somewhere around, I'm 95% if you give me the common ones of red crossbill, because I've actually been tested on this, blind tested. Type 1s and 2s of red crossbill are tricky. So, you know, my success rate drops to probably about 85%. Evening grosbeaks, they're pretty different sounding. So I think, you know, I actually never really blind tested myself, but I mean, that type 1 out west, which is the most abundant one, it just sounds so different to me than our ones that we have here in the East. So purple finches too, actually. We got a paper coming out. The eastern western purple finches are quite different sounding. Flight call, song, you know, everything pretty much. So, you know, the flight call phenomenon does not appear to exist in most of the finches, but it does occur in these smaller groups. Cocothrastus finches seem to have a red crossbill, but not white-winged crossbill. And then like purple finch, but we don't believe it exists in like red poles and siskins and stuff like that. So anyway, any other questions? And these are kind of goals that we're working on here, and you know, we appreciate any support. It's been a great ride for the last 3+ years, and I'm not slowing down. We just actually we've basically paid back about $8,000 to $10,000 in support of conservation research and education. We have a number of student projects. Now we're working with students at Cornell, at Oregon State, UC Davis. Good. So it's exciting. That's always been the dream, is to build this and then be able to fund research projects for students.
Good. So, well, thank you. Thank you for all you're doing, Matt. Appreciate it. Keep up the good work. While we're closing out, if you wouldn't mind putting your FinchCam URL in the chat so people can have that, that would be greatly appreciated. And yeah, so thank you for tuning in, everyone. And we're going to move on to the business section of our meeting. We've got lots of great things going on. Matt, you got one more thing to say?
Well, let me email you, Dan, when that goes live, because it'll go live in about 4 weeks, 3 weeks. Okay. So it's a new link. The way YouTube does it, it'll be a new link again. But I will send that to you when it's up and running. It's like the Cornell link, kind of. Okay. You know, they kind of redo that every year in October. So anyway,
with the Arkansas Bird Network.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Awesome. Thank you, Matt.
Yep, you're welcome.
Yes, yep. Thank you.
Yep. Bye-bye.